In the shadow she lurks, a digital sage. Her words cut through like a sharpened blade. Political cow, her voice brings rage. A rebel in the neon-born parade. With a keyboard she wields her might, piercing lies with truth's own light. Drifting through the endless night, exposing wrongs to make them right. Political cow calling out deceit through the screens where fake news meet. She saves us from the twisted tale. Her knowledge fights where logic fails. In a world where falsehoods grow, her wisdom like the wind it blows through every corner, every show. A beacon where the lost crowds glow. Political cow calling out deceit through the screens where fake news meet. She saves us from the twisted tale. Her knowledge fights where logic fails. In a cycle where truth gets blurred, her voice is the sword we've heard, cutting ties with every absurd, leading flocks with every word. In a world where falsehoods grow, her wisdom like the wind it blows through every corner, every show. A beacon where the lost crowds glow. Political cow calling out deceit through the screens where fake news meet. She saves us from the twisted tale. Her knowledge fights where logic fails. In a cycle where truth gets blurred, her voice is the sword we've heard, cutting ties with every absurd, leading flocks with every word.
Have birthright citizenship in response to Congressman Hunt's question, including Mexico and Canada. We are not outliers.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up because I had it in my notes to bring that up as well. So what if the Supreme Court decides that the 14th Amendment actually does not give citizenship to children born in this country to non-citizens? What if the Supreme Court made that ruling? Where does that leave the descendants of those who've been granted birthright citizenship?
Yeah, I mean, it would unwind the citizenship of the entire country. We are a nation of immigrants. A very significant majority of us trace back, really other than Native Americans, trace back our lineage to an immigrant, parent, grandparent. 5% of our military are the children of immigrants. Now, all of us, when we have a baby, the first thing we'd have to do is produce proof of our citizenship. Imagine a generation from now. It wouldn't be good enough to show your own birth certificate. You'd have to show the lineage. This is exactly what the Reconstruction Congress wanted to prevent, and it's exactly the result that Dred Scott wanted.
I appreciate that so much. So let's follow this logic. Say a person's grandparents came to this country from Central Europe in the 19th century. An investigation reveals that those grandparents used false pretenses or false names at Ellis Island. Does that mean, based on what my colleagues would be saying today, that the present-day descendants of those grandparents are not citizens?
The logic of the position is that every single person who considers themselves an American, perhaps people in Congress, certainly people voting, would suddenly be under scrutiny, and any flaw in their family's immigration history, going back to the Contract Labor Act of 1885, where if you came to the U.S. with a contract to work, that was illegal. Many people violated that law in 1885. All of those people, their descendants today, could have their citizenship questioned and could be stripped of their citizenship under the executive order.
Thank you. And if I could, in conclusion, because I see that I'm out of time, doing away with birthright citizenship is an intentional choice to give this president, I believe, massive power to dictate who is and who is not an American. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Vermont. Now I'll recognize the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this hearing, and to all of you that are serving on this panel today. The issue of birth tourism is a big concern for me and stands out as a glaring example of a loophole being taken advantage of. Mr. O'Brien, in your testimony, you shared a little bit ago with Mr. Hunt about the national security risk associated with widespread birth tourism. What are among the top countries that are taking part in this practice? Where do they come from?
Well, the largest is China. The second largest is India. And then it drops off from there, but there's still large numbers of people from a large number of countries that we should have concerns about.
Very good. And aside even from the national security risk that you've already addressed, this practice puts many of those involved in coming here in harm's way. Can you talk about how the birth tourism can harm the expectant mothers involved in this?
Certainly. It's not advisable, at least according to all of the medical personnel that I've talked to, for women who are in an advanced stage of pregnancy to do something like a 14 to 24-hour flight from China. We have seen repeatedly along the southern border people who are traveling in extremely harsh environments, attempting to cross the Rio Grande while expecting a child imminently. And so this is a danger to both the mother and the child.
Thank you. I'm also curious, while we're here, Mr. O'Brien, about the comparison between how the United States treats this concept of birthright citizenship when compared to the rest of the developed world. Is it common for other countries to automatically grant citizenship to those born on their soil?
No, it's not common. It's something that's most typically associated with the United States, Latin America, Canada, and a few other countries that have extremely truncated variations of it.
And how would you say America compares to most EU countries in regards to this issue?
It's profoundly more broad. Most countries that have birthright citizenship have significant restrictions on it compared to the United States.
Very good. Mr. McCotter, I'd like to hear from you about how Congress can play its part in this conversation. I mean, it's one thing for executive orders, it's another thing for court decisions and interpretation. What steps can Congress take to support President Trump's executive order?
I authored an amicus brief on behalf of many members of this committee, and we submitted that in almost all the district court proceedings and in several of the circuit court proceedings, so the court is at least aware of these members' views on the historical understanding of the jurisdiction clause. That's one thing, of course, Congress could do. Congress obviously could hold a hearing, which we're having now, and I'm glad to participate.
Well, I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of Representative Brian Babin's Birthright Citizenship Act of 2025, which does clarify which individuals automatically receive American citizenship at birth. In fact, I've told folks if ever there's a time for us to clarify and codify, that time is now. Would you deem it necessary that Congress clarify this question surrounding the citizenship clause, or should it be left to other institutions?
The Supreme Court has long held that the decision of citizenship is left to Congress, except, of course, as dictated by the 14th Amendment. The courts can interpret the 14th Amendment as they're doing now, but otherwise it is exclusively a congressional prerogative.
So we do have an opportunity now, and with the act introduced, to take some action on this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina. I will now recognize the gentleman from Maryland and the ranking member of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And thanks to all the witnesses for being here, and special greetings to my former colleague, Professor Frost. I want to start with you because there's been a major flurry of litigation about the onslaught of unlawful and unconstitutional executive orders that have come down from the administration. And this executive order has appeared in 4 different courts. And as I understand it, all 4 of them have worked to stop it, either through a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction. And they were appointed, by my count, by Presidents Reagan, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. And take a look at what they said. Here's Judge Kuhnauer, who was nominated by President Reagan. Citizenship by birth is an unequivocal constitutional right. It's one of the precious principles that makes the United States the great nation that it is. The president cannot change, limit, or qualify this constitutional right by executive order. I can't remember a case that presented a question as clear as this, says Judge Kuhnauer. And the fact that the government cloaked what is in fact a constitutional amendment under the guise of an executive order is equally unconstitutional. The Constitution is not something the government can play policy games with. Here's U.S. District Judge LaPlante from New Hampshire, who'd been nominated by President Bush. The plaintiffs are likely to suffer irreparable harm if the order is not granted. Here's U.S. District Judge Deborah Boardman, nominated by President Biden to the court in my home state, in Maryland. The executive order interprets the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment in a manner that the Supreme Court has resoundingly rejected and no court in the country has ever endorsed. And finally, check out Judge Sorokin, nominated to the district court in Massachusetts by President Obama, who says, the 14th Amendment says nothing of the birthright citizens' parents, in efforts to import such considerations at the time of enactment and when the Supreme Court construed the text was rejected. No federal judge, to my knowledge, has upheld this executive order against legal attack. Tell me why you think there's such unanimity across the spectrum among the judges.
Well, first of all, the language is crystal clear of the 14th Amendment. There are thorny and complicated and broad and vague provisions of the Constitution, but the Citizenship Clause could not speak more clearly. That's what the court said in Wong Kim Ark. Its language is universal. You know, I did a little research on this last night, and I found that the leaders of the writing of the first section of the 14th Amendment were Republicans from Ohio, right? John Bingham was described as the primary author of the Citizenship Clause by Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, who said he was the 14th Amendment's James Madison, the second founder who most worked to realize the universal promise of Madison's Bill of Rights and Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And another great Ohio Republican, U.S. Senator Benjamin Wade, insisted on making the Citizenship Clause perfectly clear to avoid any backsliding in times of high partisan feeling. He said, I've always believed that every person of whatever race or color who was born in the United States was a citizen of the United States. But by the decisions of the courts, there's been a doubt thrown over the subject. And if the government should fall into the hands of those who are opposed to the views that some of us maintain, those who have been accustomed to take a different view of it, they may construe the provision in such a way as we do not think liable to construction at this time, unless we fortify and make it very strong and very clear. If we do not do so, there may be danger that when party spirit runs high, it may receive a very different construction from that which we, the founders, put upon it. Now, so I wonder what you think Senator Wade might be saying about the debate today about whether it's okay just to throw away the first sentence of the 14th Amendment. Yeah, he was remarkably prescient. He foresaw a future in which a future political party would want to take away citizenship and voting and political power from groups of Americans it didn't like and didn't view as fully American.
All right, I'm sorry to rush you along here, but the original purposes of the 14th Amendment remain perfectly clear for anyone who's an originalist, right? They wanted to stop the government from reconstituting a racial or ethnic caste system based on the inheritance of a subordinate or a superior legal status from one's parents. In post-Reconstruction America, nobody would ever become a slave or a serf or a legal outcast or a prince or a princess or a king or a count at birth, because everybody here would attain equal citizenship at birth. Am I capturing it correctly?
You are.
All right, I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member of the committee, and I will now recognize Mr. Grothman for 5 minutes.
I'd like to ask one of the three gentlemen on the right here, and I've had other committee hearings, so I'm sorry if I'm going over things we've already dealt with. But it says in the 14th Amendment that citizens are people who are all persons born in the U.S. and not subject to any foreign power. I mean, they must have had something on their mind when they said not subject to any foreign power. Does anyone want to comment on that, how that little phrase there, how that affects what the original drafters intended?
I addressed some of that in my opening remarks, sir. So I think the best understanding is that it referred to children who would be deemed citizens of their parents' home country as of the moment of birth.
Okay, and right now in this country, if your wife goes to Italy and has a baby, does she become an Italian citizen? Would anybody say that?
I'm not sure what Italy's laws are. I would defer to Mr. O'Brien on that. I can say that at the time of the 14th Amendment, for example, English citizens born in the U.S. would still be deemed English citizens, and that's why they would not be entitled to birthright citizenship.
Okay. There are a variety of other countries that have some form of birthright citizenship, none of them in Europe, Canada, but you mentioned, Mr. O'Brien, that that's a limited type of a birthright citizenship. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, in most of those countries, there are restrictions that require at least one of your parents to be there lawfully. In some cases, it's birthright citizenship combined with familial lineage. There's all different ways of doing this. What I can say unequivocally is that the United States is the only place that does it the way it's done here.
Okay, so if you would interpret it the way some people want it interpreted, you would say the United States would be a clear outlier in the globe.
Yes.
And would they have been a clear outlier in 1866?
Well, yes, because at that point, most other countries in the world were monarchies, and the monarch considered you to be something akin to property owing permanent allegiance. So regardless of where you were born, you could still be considered a citizen depending upon how you had left the country.
Of course, we have records of the debate at the time in 1866. There's a quote here from Senator Howard from Michigan, making it clear, I think, that he felt we were excluding people who are foreigners or aliens normally. Do you want to elaborate on that, what the drafters at the time thought?
Sure. I think the drafters at the time were concerned about the treatment of emancipated slaves during the Reconstruction time. Frankly, at that point in time, there was a relatively small number of people in the United States, and as I had stated in my opening remarks, the concept of illegal alien was not the same as it is now.
Was there any indication at that time that in the hypothetical that the opponents of President Trump cite today, was there any indication that the drafters of the amendment believed that if somebody just came here as a visitor or whatever, we talk about, people coming from China and landing in San Diego or whatever, that the equivalent would have resulted in people being a citizen? Is there any evidence of that in, 1865, 1866?
No, the court in Won Kim Ark was very explicit when it said that it was referring to people who were residing in the United States with the permission of the government.
There's no evidence of any of the debaters at that time saying, whoosh, we're opening the door to become American citizen. Anybody who gets off, just gets off a boat.
No, and I think if you stop and think about the way the amendment was drafted, if that's what they wanted, they could have just left the qualifying statement out and said anyone born in the United States is a citizen. But they added subject to the jurisdiction thereof for a reason.
Exactly. It's in there for a purpose. It's an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. You wouldn't put that in there if you wanted anybody who just shows up to be, as a baby, to be a citizen, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Do either of the others know any examples of other countries? Any other countries that have something this broad, just so we understand the way an average person thinks about these things?
Yes, I'll say that 32 countries have birthright citizenship, just like the United States, including Canada and Mexico.
Okay, Mr. O'Brien, I think she's saying something a little misleading there. When she says just like the United States, even though there are no European countries, are they, when they have birthright citizenship, just like the United States? I think what you told me is not true.
No, to the best of my knowledge, at present, there is some kind of limitation on birthright citizenship in all the places that have it.
Well, thank you all for tolerating me, and we'll send it back to the chair.
Thank you, gentleman from Wisconsin. I now recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. I think there's a quick video that I have.
You don't need to be a genius to realize that Trump's not talking about babies that come from Norwegian vajayjays. No. He wants to white out the Constitution so that he can whiten America. That's what he's planning to do here.
All right, I just thought since, the South Africans are in the news, I would play that. I had a question for you, Mr. O'Brien. Is the Equal Protection Clause part of the 14th Amendment, yes or no?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. McCotter, is the Due Process Clause part of the 14th Amendment, yes or no?
Yes, although each clause uses different language.
Yes, I do know, but thank you for that. I ask those questions because I have heard no objection from this body, no quarrel, no disagreement with the fact that the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause are embedded in the U.S. Constitution through the 14th Amendment. In fact, this country's president, that so many revere, has invoked the Due Process Clause on the regular, as he should, because it is his right. And he has, in fact, showed the country how due process works when applied without prejudice. If only it would work for the rest of us like that, but I digress. The point is, those tenets are here to stay with birthright citizenship. So I want to talk about the times that gave rise to the 14th Amendment. It was 1868. There was the aftermath of the 4-year divisive, destructive Civil War that killed roughly 750,000 soldiers, or 2% of the population. Resistance in the form of Reconstruction, a massive tsunami in a soon-to-be U.S. territory that killed 70 people, and in the aftermath of the 1868 Louisiana Constitution, which gave black men the right to vote and a public education, you had the Louisiana Massacre, where black people were murdered trying to vote. As people would say from my hood in L.A., the white folks went cray-cray. And in spite of all of that, white congressmen showed up in 1868 to debate the 14th Amendment because in the midst of the madness and violence of the time, it was that important. And it passed with birthright citizenship, those 3 clauses. And these tenets forever changed this country. The 14th Amendment is a pillar of American law in a good way, and it has been for 160 years. Everyone recognizes that it should not be touched, that it is sacrosanct, even Justice Scalia. And Scalia, whose ideology I do not support, his reasoning is that the full 14th Amendment, which includes the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, as well as birthright citizenship, was based on originalism, textualism, and traditionalism, and that one should consider the political and intellectual climate, beliefs and prejudices of the time it was ratified, and the amendment should be protected, which is why it is worth revisiting 1868, because the origin story of the amendment is as applicable now as it was then. You had a Democratic president impeached in 1868 and a Republican president impeached in 1921. You had political violence in 1968 with the Louisiana Massacre and an insurrection that happened here in 2021 where Capitol Police were speared with American flags. You had a tsunami in Hawaii in 1868 and a fire again in 2023. You had an economic turndown in 1868 and you have $15 eggs under Trump right now in 2025. Same environment, toxic, hostile, destructive, deadly. And let's be clear, they had immigrants back then too. Irish, Jews, Germans, Italians, people who couldn't speak English, but they saw through the moment and passed the 14th Amendment. And it's not like this country has not had moments where people have felt under attack. We've had Jim Crow, World War II with the Germans, McCarthyism, the Japanese in internment camps, the Vietnam War, And birthright citizenship has survived all of that. And now, not because of war, but because somebody can't get a job at Walmart, because of xenophobia, fragile ego, and mediocrity, we are going to look for culprits instead of protecting the Constitution. It is the epitome of lazy. And if they could put the 14th Amendment in the Constitution during those hostile times, we can keep it in law during ours. The climate is not different. It is the patriotism of the Republican Party that is different. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Well, I would just observe for the record that the phrase white people be cray-cray is itself cray-cray. And I will now recognize the gentleman from California.
And also racist, of course. I was wondering how long it would take the Democrats to play the race card, and I want to thank my colleague from California for satisfying that curiosity. I think we can thank the Democrats under Joe Biden for bringing this issue to the forefront. The mass illegal migration over the last 4 years has made answering this question a necessity. Have those who've illegally entered our country in defiance of our laws and who are subject to deportation under those laws, can they be considered as having accepted the jurisdiction of the laws that their very presence defies? I don't think it does. I mean, we know that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, we know that means former slaves are citizens. That was the stated purpose of the amendment. That's the plain language of the amendment, passed, by the way, over the objections of the Democratic Party at the time. We know from the congressional debate that its authors understood its meaning to exclude foreign nationals who were merely passing through the country. But somewhere along the way, it simply seems to have become assumed. So my first question, I guess, begin with you, Mr. O'Brien. Have any laws been passed that specifically provide for birthright citizenship for illegal migrants?
No, there have been none. And one of the reasons that this interpretation persists is because this wasn't an issue at the time that the case was decided, so it was left alone.
Well, how did it come to be that it was simply assumed?
Nobody knows that. When I was at FAIR, we did an extensive research project where we spent hours trying to find this. And we couldn't find any commentary on the Wong Kim Ark decision discussing the import. We couldn't find any government directives indicating that this was the rule. It just appears to have started happening in the mid-1920s.
Mr. McConnell, can you offer any light on this subject?
I think that's probably right. I think that's probably practicality. People weren't really paying attention, perhaps, and that's how we ended up with this kind of.
So no act of Congress, no Supreme Court decision, obviously no executive order until a few weeks ago, touching on this subject.
Mr. McClintock, if I may just jump in here, I think the unfortunate reality is that the Wong Kim Ark case was misinterpreted. In much the way I think that my friend Professor Frost here misinterprets it to have been a holding, some of the very broad language that is clearly dicta, instead of the narrow and specifically identified holding, which was quite limited to people who are in this country and their, who bear children in this country, who have a permanent lawful residents in this country, at least,
and it just kind of simmered
to establish allegiance.
It just kind of simmered in the background until we had this mass historic illegal migration, and now we have to confront it. You know, the chairman says the issue belongs to Congress, and I'd say, well, sort of. Obviously, Congress can't deny automatic birthright citizenship by statute if that's what the 14th Amendment guarantees. But of course, neither could an executive order. I think Congress would have to propose a constitutional amendment to the states if that's what the 14th Amendment actually means. But if the 14th Amendment does not provide automatic birthright citizenship, and no statutes have been passed, and no other Supreme Court orders issued, it seems to me that no law would be needed to deny it. It was never extended in the first place. Is that, Mr. O'Brien, is that essentially correct?
Yes, that is correct. The question that Wong Kim Ark has been interpreted as addressing was never the question that was before the court. The case came before the court in order to determine whether Wong Kim Ark was an individual who fell into one of either the privileged or prohibited classes under the Chinese Exclusion Act, which itself was a modification of a treaty of trade and friendship between China and the United States.
They were here permanently within the laws, within the jurisdiction of the United States by act of a ratified treaty.
Yes, that's exactly it.
So if that's the case, and wouldn't the president's executive order simply be restating existing law?
I believe that's exactly what it does.
Mr. McCotter?
That's what my amicus brief on behalf of members of this committee says, sir.
Mr. Cooper?
I agree with that, Congressman McClintock.
I will just assume Professor Frost disagrees. That's it for me, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman from California. I will now recognize the ranking member, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. You know, the effort to end birthright citizenship is hardly something new. It's been the long-term goal of anti-Semitic and white nationalist groups for decades. The claim's largely based on the bigoted Great Replacement conspiracy theory, same conspiracy theory that has inspired a lot of deadly terrorist attacks in recent years. And we're hearing really uncomfortable echoes of some of that here in Congress in this day and age. You know, as we're listening to some of these statements, I was reminded of one of our predecessor statements here, the great Barbara Jordan, who at a critical moment in our country's history talked about we the people. And when that document was completed in September of 1787, neither she nor I nor Professor Frost were included in that document. But as she said, through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, we were finally included. And as members of Congress now, we should not sit here and be idle spectators, much less participants in the diminution, the subversion, or the destruction of the Constitution. And I would submit that the effort we're seeing here today to try to reinterpret and twist the clear language and legislative history of the Birthright Citizenship Clause would be such a diminution, subversion, or destruction of the Constitution. Now, Professor Frost, you've studied this for quite a long time. You, unlike several of the people here, are not a contributor to Project 2025. We've heard a lot about the specific language subject to the jurisdiction of. Why did they choose that phrase?
Yeah, the Reconstruction Congress told us clearly what they wanted to do there. They wanted to exclude the children of diplomats and ambassadors. And they also discussed at length the need to exclude children born into Native American tribes, which were separate foreign sovereigns with whom we had treaty relations, with their own courts and laws.
Okay. It did strike me the inconsistency in claiming that an undocumented immigrant is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States when they are, in fact, subject to our criminal code, paying taxes, et cetera. Can you talk about that and talk about how that relates to the issue of the exception for diplomats and their children?
Yeah, sure. Of course, all children of immigrants, and all immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, are subject to the laws of the United States. President Trump knows that better than most, in that he is seeking to deport and enforce the immigration laws and other laws fully against this group. Also add something I mentioned before, which is the Reconstruction Congress was well aware there were people in the United States in violation of the law. Those were the enslaved African Americans brought to the United States in violation of federal law. And of course, the Citizenship Clause was intended to provide them with citizenship despite the fact they were there in violation of U.S. law.
I noticed you reacting to some of the testimony about the U.S. being some kind of outlier with respect to birthright citizenship, or having, it looked like you might have a different interpretation. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, with all due respect to Mr. O'Brien, who is a deep expert in U.S. immigration law, I don't think he is familiar with the laws of the 32 other countries that have birthright citizenship, automatic birthright citizenship, just like the United States. In Canada, if you're born in Canada, regardless of who your parents are, you're a citizen. That's why Senator Ted Cruz had to renounce his Canadian citizenship in 2014, because he was born in Canada to a U.S. citizen mother.
Thank you. I also was struck by the idea that we would be putting a rather strange burden upon our maternity wards in our states if every time someone is born they have to determine the citizenship or the immigration status of their parents. And how would that play out? I mean, does the delivery nurse have to ask which border the person came across, whether or not they checked in, whether they filed an asylum claim, or whether maybe they just overstayed their visa to study here if they were, for example, from South Africa? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It would impose enormous bureaucratic burden on hospitals, on state agencies, on our already overburdened immigration officials, and on the parents of newborn children. And as an immigration lawyer, I will say many people lack documentation of their citizenship or of their immigration status if they're lawful permanent residents. They may not be able to show that. And so we are asking these people at the time of their child's birth to prove this or risk having their child be deemed an undocumented immigrant from the moment it's born.
Okay, I do think it's interesting that this is hardly the open and shut case that our colleagues would suggest. Senator Cruz was recently quoted as saying that's actually a disputed legal question. There are serious scholarly arguments on both sides, et cetera. But with that, I see my time has expired, so I would just have a unanimous consent request to enter into the record a statement of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. I will also, without objection, ask to insert in the record a collection of quotes from the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jordan. The airport bears her name. I fly in and out of in Austin, Texas, every week. But it's a collection of quotes from her service as chair of a commission regarding immigration in the 1990s, in which she makes very clear her position that the enforcement of borders security is important. The importance of having immigration policy that works is important. That we should not have amnesty. That we should immigration should not be a path to public benefits. She was very clear in her language about that. And numerous other quotes from the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jordan. And without objection, I'll insert that in the record. And I will now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Onder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My colleague from Pennsylvania mentioned the term white nationalism, and I would remind everyone of the context of the 14th Amendment, that the original white nationalists, Southern Democrats, fought a civil war to deny blacks their constitutional rights, to deny their very humanity, and then in the wake of that civil war, sought to deny them of the rights of citizenship as well. And in that context, the 14th Amendment was enacted to make sure that white nationalist Southern Democrats not deny black slaves, former slaves, of their rights, and therefore made it clear they were citizens. But Mr. McCotter, one of the authors of the 14th Amendment, Senator John Bingham, said that the Citizenship Clause conferred citizenship to every human being born within the jurisdiction of the United States of parents not owing allegiance to any foreign sovereignty. Another author of the 14th Amendment, Senator Lyman Trumbull, stated that subject to the jurisdiction of the United States in the Citizenship Clause meant not owing allegiance to anybody else. Do aliens, and particularly illegal aliens, owe allegiance exclusively to the United States, or do they still bear allegiance to their home country?
They would still bear at least partial allegiance to their home country.
And therefore, in part, foreign ambassadors, diplomats, do not have children of foreign ambassadors and diplomats do not have birthright citizenship.
That's correct. And this came up earlier in some prior questioning about how LPRs, lawful permanent residents, could somehow be included within the Birthright Citizenship Clause. And I think the response to that is that Wong Kim Ark itself recognized that those individuals do have sufficient allegiance, but that's because they're here permanently with the consent of the United States.
Okay. And, an example of, sort of the absurdity of all-out birthright citizenship, El Chapo's wife, Emma Coronel, traveled to California to give birth and then immediately returned to Mexico. Under Biden's policy, the children of a drug lord were then American citizens who had every right to American bank accounts, and indeed they obtained American bank accounts. Did El Chapo's children, did they own full allegiance to the United States?
They would not, no. Their children would have been at least partially allegiant to their parents' home country.
And so it is that, and I think in your testimony it's very clear that this idea of full allegiance is pivotal here.
It was the widely understood understanding of the jurisdiction clause at the time it was ratified, yes.
Okay.
And if I may just briefly respond to the claim that some of the arguments in this area are inherently racist in some way, I'd point out in Wong Kim Ark, Justice John Harlan, the sole dissenter from Plessy v. Ferguson, the patron of interpreting the Constitution as colorblind, he dissented in Wong Kim Ark and said that Wong had never become a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, and likewise, if I recall, it was what Filer v. Doe, in which Justice Brennan, in dictum, in a footnote, opined that that anyone born physically in the United States be a birthright citizen. Does dictum have the same force of law as a holding in a case?
It doesn't, and also in that footnote, Justice Brennan said that jurisdiction, the phrase jurisdiction, is bounded only, if at all, by principles of sovereignty and allegiance. The exact same things we've already talked about.
Which is what you're arguing today. Okay, thank you. The gentleman yields. All right, I appreciate that. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I would just ask, Professor Frost, we talked a little bit earlier about the extent to which we've got the record is replete with examples of tourism, birth tourism, in which there are, malactors who are profiting by moving people into, or transporting people into the United States to then deliver babies. So we have Georgetown Law report talking about women from foreign countries, China and Russia, paying tens of thousands of dollars to temporarily relocate to the United States, give birth, and then often return. We have that happening at the southern border with some regularity. In McAllen, we have it in Laredo, we have it in El Paso, throughout Texas. I certainly can attest personally. You believe that all of those children, regardless of why they end up on American soil, that those children are, in fact, U.S. citizens under the law?
I'm so glad you asked that, because there's actually a federal regulation, 22 CFR 41.31, which bars people from coming to the United States to give birth and gives consular officials the authority to bar anyone visibly pregnant from giving birth.
Individual, but that's not the question. The question is these babies are born on American soil. These babies are born on American soil. They are brought here. They're brought here for profit. Are they citizens, yes or no?
Yes, they're citizens, and if you have a problem, enforce the regulation.
So the question is that they are, in fact, citizens under your interpretation of the law. Mr. McCotter, you noted just a minute ago that, in fact, Justice Harlan was the lone dissent in Plessy, correct?
That's correct, yes.
But was also a dissenter in Wong.
Right, he joined the Chief Justice.
So a threshold question here is, with respect to Wong, which is often cited as the basis now 130 years hence for these individuals being viewed as citizens by now in this instance, the most pernicious models where people are profiting for bringing people into the United States to have babies, exploit our laws, go back to their countries or exploit our laws for citizenship, that they are deemed citizens based on an interpretation of an opinion 130 years ago. Yes or no, Mr. McCotter, do you believe that Wong stands for that premise?
I do not, and I cite support for that in the brief.
You believe that it is limited to, at most, an LPR type status under today's law?
Right, here's a quote. Wong, by its facts and some of its language, is limited to children born of parents who at the time of birth were in the United States lawfully and indeed were permanent residents. That's from a professor at NYU.
Mr. Cooper, do you share that view?
I do share that view, and I would point out again that Wong itself conditioned its irresistible conclusion from the 14th Amendment. It affirms the ancient and fundamental rule of citizenship by birth within the territory in the allegiance and under the protection of the country. which was premised in that case on the parents of Wong being lawful permanent residents, allegiant to this country.
So to be clear, Mr. Cooper, you do not believe that that Wong's opinion extends, certainly at a minimum, beyond, again, what we would characterize under today's law as an LPR status individual?
No, it clearly just didn't have anything to do, as Mr. O'Brien has said, with illegal aliens or aliens here who may be here lawfully, but only temporarily.
And are you aware of any opinion by the United States Supreme Court that has extended beyond that interpretation since Wong?
No.
Mr. McCotter, do you agree with that?
I agree, yes.
Mr. O'Brien, do you agree with that?
I do.
And so now, having, I think, established that that is, in fact, the state of the law with respect to Wong and everything since Wong, now my question is Wong itself correct? We have an opinion by Mr. Justice Harlan. Justice Harlan, who was the dissent in Plessy, was Plessy later overturned? Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. McCotter?
Yes.
Overturned. Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Professor Frost? Plessy was overturned.
Yes.
Now we've got Wong. Is Wong itself correct on the law with respect to even LPRs under the interpretation of the 14th Amendment? I would ask Mr. Cooper your opinion on that.
Well, I will tell you, Mr. Chairman, that I think there's significant support for the conclusion, the holding in Wong, in the debates under the Citizenship Clause. But one doesn't have to conclude that it is correct in order to uphold this executive order, because the executive order is entirely consistent with Wong.
Mr. McCotter, do you have anything to add to that? Mr. O'Brien, and then I will be done with my time.
No, sir.
Mr. O'Brien, anything to add?
I do not believe it was correct, and I would go so far as to say that the holding itself should be considered limited to the terms that were before the court, which had to do with a treaty with China, which is no longer in existence.
I appreciate it, gentlemen. We now have another member of the committee, and I will recognize my colleague and my friend from Texas, Mr. Gill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 160 years ago, Democrats were asking us, if it weren't for slavery, who would pick our cotton? And today they're asking a similar question, which is, if it weren't for mass migration, who would pick our avocados? It's a similar pattern that they've established. You can say that the United States is not, in fact, better off by importing a massive class of what is virtually serf labor, which undermines our cultural fabric and our government as well. I'd also like to point out that the admission that we need more and more unvetted illegal aliens pouring into our country is also an admission that the goal, or one of the goals, of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle is explicitly to reduce American wages, because that's exactly what they're doing and what they're saying they're doing whenever they talk about bringing in cheap labor. We're talking here about birthright citizenship, and which has provided an enormous loophole in our immigration system and has facilitated the mass importation of illegal aliens. Through this current loophole, upwards of 300,000 people a year are granted automatic citizenship in the United States, despite being born to parents who have no ties to our country and who are here illegally. And also due to failures in our legal immigration system, these individuals then use their citizenship to sponsor their illegal alien parents and other family members for a green card, which creates a never-ending cycle of people coming into the country who have no business being here at all. We've now gotten to the point where the percentage of America's foreign-born population is quickly approaching 15%, which is the highest it's been since at least 1910. Mr. O'Brien, I'd like to start with you with a couple questions, if you don't mind. Under the 14th Amendment, Native Americans, due to tribal allegiances, were not granted citizenship. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Got it. And the children of foreign diplomats were also expressly excluded from birthright citizenship.
That's correct.
Got it. From the available evidence, is it safe to say that the authors of the 14th Amendment understood a difference between total allegiance to the United States compared to simply being subject to the legal jurisdiction by nature of presence in our country?
Yes, I think they made that very clear in the debates.
Got it. And in your opinion, based off this difference, would the authors of the 14th Amendment conclude that an individual whose parents did not owe total allegiance to the United States be granted birthright citizenship?
No, I think the import of the holding in Wong Kim Ark was that only individuals who were lawfully present in the United States could transmit citizenship to their children born, or I should say, only the children born of people who were lawfully present in the United States could acquire citizenship at birth.
Mm-hmm. And despite all this, some of my colleagues here still contend that essentially any person born here, regardless of their legal status or the legal status of their parents, have a constitutional right to become a United States citizen. Have you seen any evidence to suggest that the authors of the 14th Amendment would support that view?
No, and I don't think the authors of the opinion in Wong Kim Ark would have supported it either.
Got it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time back to you.
Well, I thank my colleague from Texas. I would now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for a unanimous consent request.
Yes, I seek unanimous consent to introduce Barbara Jordan's obituary in the New York Times from January 18th, 1996, in which it notes that she spoke out against a proposal to deny automatic citizenship to the children of illegal immigrants, saying, I quote, "To deny birthright citizenship would derail this engine of American liberty."
Without objection. And I would ask consent to insert into the record the amicus brief that was submitted by a number of House colleagues. It was drafted by Mr. McCotter. I would also like to introduce into the record a note that was written by Amy Swearer from the Heritage Foundation, who has written extensively on this issue, and also a op-ed that was written by Mr. Cooper, along with Pete Patterson, on this subject as well. Without objection, I'll insert that in the record. That concludes today's hearing. We thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
improper payment estimates. I mean, I think it's not good management to not know how much you're paying that you shouldn't be paying. It's not good fiscal stewardship. So I'm very disappointed they're not reporting, and I would encourage the Congress and the Trump administration to require the reporting now.
I would agree with you wholeheartedly. Let me ask you the question. The agencies that didn't report, some of them vary in size. Obviously, Department of Homeland Security is a major department of the federal government.
Right.
Considering that, let's just say for estimate's sake, I don't have the report in front of me, that in fiscal year of 23, improper payments were $250 billion. If we had the estimates of those 7 departments, what do you think the actual outstanding was from 2023?
Yeah, I really can't hesitate to guess. The one thing Congress needs to do in this area, though, the temporary assistance for needy families, they believe, HHS, they can't make an estimate unless Congress changes the law. So they refuse to do it, saying they don't have the legal authority to require the states to give them the information they need in order to make an improper payment estimate. So Congress needs to change the statute there, and I think that's important.
All right, thank you. FEMA is currently managing over 600 major disaster declarations, some of which have occurred 20 years ago. One of the GAO recommendations is in this year's high-risk report is that FEMA should identify and document lessons learned related to estimating obligations for catastrophic disasters. Can you expand upon this?
Yeah, I'll ask Mr. Curry's our expert.
Sure. Mr. Curry, thank you.
Sure. FEMA's always struggled with this because they don't know how much they're going to need in a particular year. And then when you have a catastrophic disaster season like you had last year in your home state with Helene and Milton, that throws everything off. But COVID really threw this off because FEMA did not expect to spend what it spent on COVID. At the end of this year, it's going to have spent well north of $150 billion on COVID. And what that's done is it's sort of thrown all the estimates off. It's gone up over time, which affects their estimates moving forward. And they're spent way more than they thought they were going to have to spend on that. And that's one of the reasons the Disaster Relief Fund is in this constant negative situation. It's supposed to be, actually, it's going to be $12 billion underwater already at the end of September, even after the supplemental appropriation that you all provided it late last year. So FEMA's
not to cut you off, but to go down this line of that we're talking about, is FEMA still having to make payments out associated with COVID-19?
Absolutely, they're still making payments.
Do you have an estimate of how much FEMA is still appropriating out because of COVID-19?
Well, last time I checked, which was at the end of February, they were upwards of $130 billion they'd have paid out, and they expect to spend over $150 billion at the end of fiscal year. They also told us they expect the disaster to run through the end of FY26 next year and spend almost $180 billion on that. So they're still reimbursing state and local governments for that.
Okay, so they're expected to spend another $180 billion reimbursing state and local governments for COVID-19, and that's a stretch?
Sorry, another $50 billion.
Oh, another $50 billion to take it to $180 billion.
Exactly.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'm out of my time. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Daddario, thank you for your time and your service.
Chair recognizes Mr. Subramaniam.
Subramaniam, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry.
That's okay. Before we go on to this, someone had said earlier that we cannot cut Medicaid here in Congress, and I just want to make sure everyone knows at home that that's not true. In fact, my state, this Republican budget, which it does, would cut Medicaid benefits even a little bit. Everyone who benefited from Medicaid expansion in Virginia would actually lose that benefit, and so it would hurt us and many other states, millions of people across the country. But moving on, thank you, Mr. Daddario, for coming. I saw in the news that DOGE had a savings dashboard online. Have you seen this savings dashboard, this website, doge.gov?
I have not.
/savings?
No.
Okay, well, I have it up here. It says, let's balance the budget. DOGE's total estimated savings are $65 billion. But I'd like to enter into the record this article, February 25th, from the New York Times. Doge quietly deletes the 5 biggest spending cuts it celebrated last week. The subtitle is "The cuts highlighted on an earlier version of the wall of receipts contained mistakes that vastly inflated the amount of money saved." How much money do you think Doge is actually saving? Do you have just an estimate?
I don't know.
You don't really know? I don't know either. In fact, a lot of us don't know. We really want to ask them. It would be really nice if we could. Have you met with anyone at Doge or Elon Musk?
I have not. No. We have had a couple of our people meet with some Doge people at the Treasury Department to talk about our audits of the general fund of the Treasury. Since we audit the federal government's financial statements, we also audit the general fund, which is all the cash payment systems over there, too. They had some questions about our report. That's the extent of it so far. We have a number of requests from Congress to begin looking at their access to systems, and we will begin that work at a number of agencies across government.
I've sent a lot of letters. Do you think, have they responded to any of your requests so far?
We're just getting started.
Have you sent any actual requests to them?
We've asked for an entrance meeting at the Treasury Department, and so we expect to.
What do they say?
Well, we're in a process. As far as I know, we're not having any.
Okay. I tried to get into the Treasury Department. They wouldn't let me in. So.
Yeah, well, we're their auditors.
I guess that makes sense, but I'm a member of Congress. That's why I was confused.
I expect and anticipate cooperation.
Interesting. And so just going on, I've heard a lot that this is about addressing the federal debt. And if you got rid of every single federal civil servant, how much of the federal debt would that actually pay down? Like, what do you think the percentage?
Yeah, the total federal payroll is less than 10% of the federal government's expenditures. Even the problem with our debt is you could eliminate almost the entire discretionary part of the budget, which is about 20, and still not really make an impact long term on the deficit path that we're on right now. I mean, you're 36 trillion, in debt right now. The debt to GDP ratio from debt held by the public as a percent of gross domestic product this year will be 100%. In our entire history, it's been 106% during World War II.
Sure.
Absent any change in fiscal policy, by 2050, it'll be over 200% of debt to GDP ratio. The only way to deal with this is to deal with the main driver, which is healthcare costs. Now, you can make inroads. You can make inroads, but in terms of
but I would just say, so I would conclude from that then that this effort isn't actually doing much, if anything, to reduce the federal deficit, to reduce our federal debt. In fact, it's a drop in the bucket, I would say. And now let's look at what the federal civil servants who are being fired en masse, being targeted en masse, are actually doing. They're firing nuclear safety experts. Accidentally, they're trying to call them back. They can't even find some of their emails. They deleted all their contact info. They fired the staff researching bird flu, actually, which is very relevant today. They cut FDA, NIH, and CDC staff. Some of the high-risk projects that you're talking about, the staff that's integral to implementing a lot of your recommendations were actually fired. And then even the website I was just talking about, this wall of receipts, they actually messed that up too. They said that they cut about $8 billion at ICE, but it was actually $8 million. And then that's setting aside the fact that they gave accidentally, perhaps, self-proclaimed racists actually read and write access to the critical Treasury data that includes almost every American's personal information. And so I just doesn't seem like this is actually a very good. If they're trying to cut the deficit, if they're trying to get rid of waste, fraud, abuse, they're doing a really bad job, it sounds like. Thank you. I yield my time.
Chair recognizes Mr. Burleson from Missouri.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's good to see you again. I will be sad when after you leave. You had mentioned in the previous conversation the debt to GDP ratio at nearly 100%, but according to the debt clock at 36 trillion, with a GDP of 29.6 trillion, we're actually at 123%.
Well, if you count, I'm counting just debt held by the public. The 36 includes debt that we owe to ourselves and intergovernmental transfers like back to Social Security and Medicare trust funds. So you're right. If you use gross debt, I'm using just debt held by the
And
public.
over the next 10 years, we're planning to add another 20 trillion on the current spend level, correct?
Yeah.
So at what point do we end up in a situation where the interest, we can't make the interest payments?
I think this is the big issue. And I've said we have tremendous interest rate exposure because we borrow short term. So we're always refinancing the debt that we had before. We never pay down any of it.
And rates are going up.
And rates are going up, and that's what's happened. The interest on the debt in 2023 was $352 billion. This year it'll be $1 trillion. So, compound interest works well when you're saving, but not when you're borrowing.
Yeah, and that's why, for me, the alarming number was seeing that the growth in the interest payments from last year to this year has been near over $200 billion.
Yes.
Just in the growth.
Right.
So when we're talking about a reconciliation package, if you're just going to cover the growth in the interest payments, you need to find savings of at least $2 trillion over the next 10 years, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is a big problem.
It is a really big problem, and I would really welcome if our Democratic colleagues would recognize this is not a Republican problem. It's not a Democrat problem. This is a math problem. This is a serious thing that I think we only have maybe a handful of years left to correct this before we end up in a debt spiral.
Absolutely. And you're also going to confront the depletion of the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare
in
Part A Trust Fund in
8 years.
Yes.
To 11
years.
Yeah,
and it depends on the trustees' estimates will be out in another couple of months, and I wouldn't be surprised if those dates are moved up a tad.
So if we're having a mandatory spending conversation, and this is what my question to you is that if, as someone who doesn't, and I think that we universally, even though we're going to be criticized as though we're trying to kick people off of Medicaid, if the goal is not to kick anybody off of Medicaid that needs it, what are the different solutions that are in our toolbox where we could eliminate improper pay? I would hope to think that Democrats are not opposed to eliminating improper payments in Medicaid.
No.
Right? One would hope. One would hope that they would not be opposed to finding fraudsters or people that are, that are not supposed to be receiving the benefits. One would hope that you would want to find ways of getting the best bang for your buck within the program. So, for example, and that's what I want to kind of drill down to. At the end of the day, this is the healthcare industry and the costs of healthcare that the federal government is having to deal with Medicaid and Medicare and even the insurance on the lives of the federal workforce, correct?
Yes.
So what can we do? Have you guys seen anything that can be done that would actually have an impact in driving down healthcare costs?
Yeah. This is a compound problem because you got healthcare costs going up faster than the economy, and you have the demographics are working against us because they're older people that are hitting the payroll. It's just a combination of both things.
And then I wanted to,
Sure.
if you could answer this before my time runs out, within your answer, I noticed there was a study that was done in 2019. I'm hoping that you have new studies that indicated when you studied the impact that PBMs had and whether or not that money was actually, the savings was actually coming back to the federal government or to and if there's new data, because at that time it was 96% that was coming back in savings. So
on the PBM issue, I'm going to have to get back to you on how much we are doing some current work in that area. In terms of what would drive down, so the way you pay for services, the responsibility of the patients for cost sharing, those are the types of things where the government could take some action. So, for example, we've had a longstanding recommendation. You all have considered this in multiple Congresses of
exactly why that is so.
First and foremost, and I think most crucially, the $880 billion in cuts to Medicaid. The largest cuts in American history to Medicaid. Why is that important? 72 million Americans rely on Medicaid. Another 20 million rely and get their health care through the Affordable Care Act. They are also at risk. We have heard further that while those are the biggest cuts, there are even more, hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to nutrition assistance, school lunch programs, Pell Grants, Head Starts, and the list goes on and on. And why? All to deliver $4.5 trillion of tax cuts to the richest 1% of Americans. And let's not forget the fact that in order to cover the rest of the cost of those tax cuts, they are increasing the debt limit by $4 trillion. They like to talk about debt and how horrible it is, but this piece of legislation will make our debt situation far worse. This is the Republican betrayal of the middle class. Day after day, in my home state of Pennsylvania, you had candidates from both sides talking about how the #1 priority should be to lower costs for Americans. The president made that promise. He said he would do it on day one. Well, here we are more than a month in, not one executive order, not one bill to lower costs for the American people. Instead, we have this bill to take money from the middle class and give it to those who need it the least. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to lead the opposition to this Republican betrayal of the middle class. I urge every member of this House to vote no. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make my closing remarks consume as much time as we have on the clock here, but let me also pay respects to my ranking member. He is a great guy. He has been a really good partner. We've done some really important things together on a bipartisan basis. In fact, we passed more bipartisan legislation to fix the broken budget process, which doesn't serve either party in this institution well, and I give him equal credit, if not more credit, because when you're in the minority, there's tremendous pressure not to work with the majority. But he's an American first, and we may disagree, but I know where his heart is. Now, let me answer the question of the ranking member. The $5 trillion is a CBO score. That's a 10-year budget window score, just like the $2 trillion that we have as a goal to reduce reckless, wasteful, and fraudulent spending. Now, Mr. Chairman, the reconciliation process is generally to reconcile the House and Senate budgets, but more than a process for matching up revenues and outlays, this exercise, more importantly, is reconciling the difference between the American people's interest, expectations, and values, and a federal government that has totally lost its way, forgotten who it serves, and too often has failed to faithfully and fairly and efficiently execute the laws of the land. And if we learned anything from the November election, it's that the American people want a strong country. They want a competent leader, common sense policies, and they want all of us to put America first. And that's what this budget resolution does. I'd like to think of this budget resolution as a promissory note to our children to preserve the land of liberty and opportunity by safeguarding it from an unwieldy government and with unbridled spending, taxing, and regulating that threatens to destroy it. Mr. Chairman, I said this in the Budget Committee, and I'm going to say it now to close. The era of wasteful, woke, and weaponized government is over, and this budget resolution will be its tombstone. Here lies one of the darkest chapters in American history: open borders, record crime, lawlessness, feckless foreign policies, cost of living crises. Enough. It's time to reverse the curse. It's time to reverse the reckless spending, the failed policies, do the first and most important job of the federal government, keep the American people safe. That's exactly what we intend to do, and that's exactly what we've delivered with this framework. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on House Concurrent Resolution 14, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman, Mr. Schweikert, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Beyer, each will control 30 minutes on the subject of economic goals and policies. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
And Mr. Chairman, and to the minority, I first want to apologize to everyone. I have one of my crappy lung infections, so at some point I'm going to start coughing and doing an inhaler. Just ignore me. Somehow I thought that'd be funnier. Mr. Chairman, and to my good friend Mr. Beyer, this I think is somewhat of a unique opportunity for those of us from the Joint Economic Committee. We actually take math seriously. We don't always see things alike. But the fact of the matter is, the Joint Economic Committee, I think started in 1956, has this remarkable history of some of the world's greatest economists coming and speaking before it and walking us through it. And that's why this moment, we're going to try to do something that's special. Instead of just sort of sharing feelings, I'm going to ask us to share math. And within that, we're going to walk through what's actually in the budget resolution. This is a reconciliation budget. It's not a regular budget. This is a budget that opens up the ability, because the insanity we go through of moving something through the Senate and it's 60 votes. So the 1974 Budget Control Act, this is the dance we go through. The other thing I'm going to try to walk through is where the actual math lays in the box that's been given to us by the Budget Committee. And then the part I'm going to do, the Schweikert little bit of hope, is this the moment? Is this the moment of policy that actually forces us, both the left and the right, that if there's cuts, modernization, changes, updates in methodology of how we deliver services, is this the stressor that makes us do something that's hard, but also do something that's truthful? I'm also going to try repeatedly to make the point, Mr. Chairman, and show why are we primarily doing this. We have a handful, actually a bunch of provisions of the 2017 tax reform that begin to expire. Most of those provisions actually are the benefit of small businesses and the working class. And I will show that over and over, and the distributional effects. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to this budget resolution, and I yield such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this budget is disastrous for the American economy. It will balloon our deficits, it will lead to higher interest rates, and will make the things Americans buy every day more expensive. It will slash critical investments in the things that make us healthier, safer and more productive. Things like cancer research, aviation security, and our national park system. And it will decimate critical programs that support the people we represent, stripping health care from millions and make it harder for families to put food on the table and make ends meet. All of this for billionaires and corporations that get tax cuts they do not need and that our country cannot afford. I'm pleased to do this with my friend, Chairman Schweikert. I also believe in math, and I rarely brag, but I'm good at math. Americans have been clear. They want lower prices and an economy that works for them. Yet instead of focusing on making life easier for American families, at every turn, this administration and our Republican colleagues have engaged in a scorched earth policy, a policy that creates chaos across the country as the richest person on the planet. My friend from South Carolina earlier said the policies would bankrupt our country. What's he mean? Health care for our families? Food for the working poor who overwhelmingly live in Republican districts? Sure, get rid of any identified bloat, as every president does. But this is a budget about billionaires, not about the every American women, men, and children we represent. Yes, I want to move towards a much smaller budget deficit. I listen to David Schweikert every closing afternoon during his special order hours. I hate the higher interest costs, but who pays? Our families or the 1,000 billionaires, that small percentage, 1% or less, of American population that has way more wealth than they could ever spend in lifetimes to come. You know, this budget depends on, my Republicans have long sung from the altar of fiscal responsibility, yet the plan they put in front of us today is a fiscal sacrilege. It depends on fantasy math. It ignores that their deficit-busting tax breaks will add at least $4.6 trillion on our nation's credit card, adding even more interest that our families must pay. And this interest has real costs. It slows economic growth. It depresses the standard of living. It leads to higher inflation and higher interest rates, and it makes it even harder for families already faced with high prices and borrowing costs to make ends meet. Wasteful, woke, and weaponized policies, my friend from Texas said, that's a very small percentage of the federal budget. You're going to never achieve what's in this budget resolution on wasteful, woke, and weaponized policies. So what is this Republican plan? How do they address? They double down on the policies that will widen the growing wealth gap this nation by giving billionaires trillions in handouts while providing pennies to the middle class. According to the Treasury Department, the top 1% of Americans, those making over $750,000 a year, can expect to get an annual tax cut of over $32,000. Working families will see a tiny fraction of that. Of course, the other main beneficiaries will be the wealthiest executives of the wealthiest corporations at a time when corporate profits are at an all-time high. Americans who rely on government services will be told they need to make sacrifices to pad those profit margins even further. How does that make any sense? To pay for these tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy, the Republican budget proposes to cut programs Americans rely on to afford health care and to put food on the table. Almost 100 million Americans, including seniors, children, families, and those from every corner of this country, depend on Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act to afford medical care. Yet this budget would slash almost $900 billion from these critical programs, ripping away life-saving coverage and raising health care costs for those who rely on them. And at a time when prices at the grocery stores continue to climb, this budget would make it even harder for the 40 million Americans who rely on SNAP to put food on the table. The budget we are considering today will nothing to support the economic growth of this nation. It will benefit the wealthiest at the expense of those who make this country work, and I urge my colleagues to reject it. With that, I reserve, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. All right, let's, I've got to figure out, do I sit here and just spend my time correcting things that are mathematically not true or not in the design of what's actually here, or just over and over say how much I like working with Mr. Byer as because one day you'll be the chair and I'll be in your position. So let's actually walk through some basic math together. What will our spending be this year? It will be $7 trillion. What is actually in the cuts? Remember, the horrible draconian cuts is $120 billion in a year. So 7 trillion, a trillion is 1,000 billion for those of you who are math dysfunctional. Let's walk through. And 120 billion is the Armageddon. So let's actually have a little, and I'm probably going to end up using these a couple times here because I think they make a point. The way a reconciliation budget is laid out, it creates a series of boxes. Here's all these authorizing committees. We need you to find savings. We need you to find those savings through modernization, through waste and fraud. And we're going to spend a little time actually talking about some great documents even the Biden administration produced on waste and fraud. And I'm sure every member here has actually read them and some of the other articles we have from Wall Street Journal doing on Medicare Advantage and all these others. And many of them, when all added up, are $1 trillion+. Are we capable of actually being intellectually honest and walking through? So one of the charts, and we're going to come back to this again, is you've been hearing the Armageddon being said, but it's Medicaid. Look, I used to do my state's Medicaid budgets. Now, Arizona has a somewhat unique system. We actually buy managed care, capitated policies for our indigent population, and it's remarkably effective. And we deliver remarkably effective health care cheaper than almost every other state in the country, demonstrating that actually plan design, managed design, actually can both be very much healthier for our society and save money. But you don't actually start to have those revolutionary conversations in Congress until you have moments of stress like this. So once again, I just want to add, in the document, 96% of the budget authority within energy and commerce is not touched. We're talking 4% of their budget authority, and that's spread over a decade. If we can't find 4% of modernization in these programs, we're actually in much more trouble than even just the brain trust here as we tell our stories. And with that, Madam Chair, I reserve.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. While we're doing math, when I divide $2 trillion in savings and cuts over 10 years, I get $200 billion a year. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Massachusetts, the whip of the House Democratic Caucus, Ms. Clark.
How much time?
For 4 minutes, Madam Speaker.
The gentlewoman's recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Despite all the promises on the campaign trail, House Republicans have chosen to do 3 things with their majority: raise the cost of putting food on the table, raise the cost of getting health care, and use that money, deserving taxpayers' money, to cut billionaires' taxes. That's it. That's the agenda. And let's look at the scale of what they're sacrificing. Funding that feeds 15 million children, a program that pays for half of all the births in America, a service that keeps nursing homes and health centers' doors open, all to cut Elon's taxes. If that sounds outrageous to you, Madam Chair, and I sure hope it does, you are not alone. Let's be clear about the kind of money we're talking about. You know what it costs to keep a kid on Medicaid? $10 a day. How about keeping that child fed with SNAP benefits? $6 a day. What do Republicans want to give away to the already rich? $6 million per billionaire. Think about that. For a billionaire, $6 million is not even a rounding error. For a hungry child, it's enough to eat every single day for 34 lifetimes. Inflicting hunger on children to give billionaires money they don't need and won't even notice? There is no moral code under which that is acceptable. There is no public demand for it. There is no logical reason for it other than total fealty to billionaire donors, billionaires who will never feel they have enough. I'll close with a family that has been on my mind. A mom-to-be, 5 months pregnant. She and her husband are happy, they're in love, and they are excited for their daughter to arrive. But every month, their budget is tight. They get a little bit of help from food pantries, but sometimes, even if they arrive by 6 a.m., the food is already gone. Without the SNAP program, the mom said, I honestly don't know what we would do. Honestly, don't know what we would do. Every Republican has a choice to make with this vote. Will they vote to keep that mom and her daughter fed, or will they keep padding the pockets of those who will not even notice? The American people can forgive a lot, but they will not forgive this betrayal. I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Woman, look, I love public policy by storytelling, but this being the Joint Economic Committee, let's actually go back to math. And to Mr. Beyer, I want to make sure I'm communicating right, but at least we're down to, instead of the Armageddon, his number was, well, if you cut $2 trillion over 10 years, that's $200 billion. He's right, but that's actually not what's in the document here. It's functioning 1.2 with a shock absorber. Once again, I'll give you the shock absorber, depending on what Ways and Means ultimately does. So thank you again. I mean, it shows actually we're fairly close on math. Another thing, and this is just someone who actually had worked on the tax reform in 2017 and the storytelling that has existed, particularly with my brothers and sisters on the left. Madam Chairwoman, how would you feel if I could document to you that the post-2017 tax reform was more progressive? Now, there were lower rates, but the top portion of income earners actually were paying a higher percentage of federal income tax. So when you actually start looking at this, remember, and this is the distributional problem that I was going to try to walk through. I believe if when you do the math here, 5% of the population, now these are people making stunning amounts of money. And if we want to have a discussion, should they pay more? Guess what? This opens up that discussion because there are no rates locked into this. It just creates the capacity to now have the discussion. But the fact of the matter, the top 5% pay 38% of all federal income taxes. Functionally half the workers in the United States pay less than 1%. And the bottom, and I'll take a correction if someone actually knows the actual number. I think the bottom 25% actually receives more because substantially earned income tax credit, which is the old negative income tax model. Look, we have a distributional problem. If you want to have a discussion of wealth and income equality, I have some great charts to show you of what inflation did, what the previous, punctually 3.5 years of inflation did to wealth in the working class. When you inflate up people who have assets and you crush those who are trying to survive, congratulations. But remember, before the pandemic, under the TCJA, the tax reforms of 2017, it was the fastest closure of income inequality in American history. What's being discussed here is, do you allow those very tax benefits for small businesses, for individuals, to expire? Now, we don't get a huge economic pop from continuing them. You maintain consumption, but we know if you don't do them, that loss of consumption in those populations actually really hurts us economically. I'm going to reserve in a moment But then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about some of the other provisions that were just, once again, Madam Chair, just trying to create the capacity so we can actually have the more elegant debate of what should the distributional effects be? Where do we get the most economic growth from? And next time we're going to come back, let's actually do a bit of where the economic growth can come from, and we'll walk through what the model of expensing and those things. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To add to the distributional impacts, the top 5% pay 38% of the taxes, but they have more than 60% of the wealth. The bottom 10% pay very little, but live hand to mouth, including more than 12% of our children. Madam Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, the chairman, the distinguished chair of the House Democratic Caucus.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to this Republican budget. House Democrats came to Congress ready to work with our Republican colleagues to lower the cost of eggs, take on price gouging, expand the child tax credit, build more housing, and put the pocketbooks of working families first. This is what the American people told us was their top priority. And these are the issues that drive our caucus. Instead, Madam Chair, they have turned their attention to the only policy priority that they really care about: ensuring billionaires pay less. My constituents can't afford eggs at the local grocery store, while my Republican colleagues are fighting amongst themselves about who to hand out tax breaks to, corporations or individuals. Tesla pays $0 in federal taxes, while teachers and firefighters in San Bernardino are paying more than their fair share. Here is the reality, Madam Chair. My Republican colleagues are going to take away health care from more than 10 million Californians to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. This is not going to make the cost of eggs cheaper or housing less expensive, but it is going to put children and seniors who need health care at risk. House Democrats believe that the people who work for a living ought to get a little breathing room, and the wealthy and well-connected shouldn't get special treatment. The Republican budget is not good for the economy, it's not good for the country, and it's a betrayal of the middle class. I urge a no vote.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I actually made a board for what the gentleman's point was, showing that within this budget this reconciliation budget document, how much additional tax cuts are there for C corporations? There's your board. Being a little sarcastic, but that's sort of a personality trait. The fact of the matter is, once again, the talking points don't match up with the reality here. Your taxes, everyone in this room, your taxes go up at the end of this year. If you run a small business, a pass-through, not a C corporation, a pass-through, your taxes go up. If you're part of an employee-owned company, so you've come together and you're managing yourselves almost like an employee co-op, your taxes go up. Now, what also do I hope, but I don't know if the capacity that this creates will allow us to do it, but I sure hope so. We have some great data, and I won't make you live through my charts, that show expensing. Research and development expensing and expensing. It has a cost in the 10-year window. Okay, hopefully everyone has listened to my dozens and dozens and dozens of speeches walking through what expensing is. Expensing is nothing more than depreciation. Do you take it in 1 year or, let's pretend, 7 years? But you still get the exact same amount of reduction in your taxes. It's a timing effect. The difference is if you can take it in the first year, if you do it over 7, you have to finance it. We actually have great economic modeling that shows when you do expense research and development, when you do expensing, you actually get a virtuous cycle of, well, we bought the piece of equipment, so we do it better, faster, cheaper.
In the shadows she lurks, a digital sage. Her words cut through like a sharpened blade. Political cow, her voice brings rage. A rebel in the neon-born parade. With a keyboard she wields her might, piercing lies with truth's own light. Drifting through the endless night, exposing wrongs to make them right. Political cow calling out deceit through the screens where fake news meet. She saves us from the twisted tale. Her knowledge fights where logic fails. In a world where falsehoods grow, her wisdom like the wind it blows through every corner, every show, a beacon where the lost clouds glow. Political cow calling out deceit through the screens where fake news meet. She saves us from the twisted tale. Her knowledge fights where logic fails. In a cycle where truth gets blurred.